Friends, in light of the events of this past week, I've changed my reading this morning that I'd like to share with you, and instead would like to offer this poem that I may have shared earlier in the year. It's a poem by Rebecca Baggett, and it's called Testimony. And it bears a dedication that reads, "To my daughters." To my daughters. I want to tell you that the world is still beautiful. I tell you that despite children shot down in schoolrooms, despite the slow poisons seeping from old and hidden sins into our air, soil, and water, despite the thinning film that encloses our aching world, despite my own terror and despair. I want you to look again and again to recognize the tender grasses curled like a baby's fine hairs around your fingers as a recurring miracle. To see that the river rocks shine like God, that the crisp voices of the orange and gold October leaves are laughing at death. I want you to look beneath the grass, to note the fragile hieroglyphs of ant, snail, beetle. I want you to understand that you are no more and no less necessary than the brown recluse, the ruby-throated hummingbird, the humpback whale, the profligate mimosa. I want to say, like Neruda, that I am waiting for a great and common tenderness. And that I still believe we are capable of attention. And that anyone who notices the world must want to save it. So friends, on Thursday morning, after news spread of the murder of 19 fourth graders and their teachers in Uvalde, Texas, I drove my fourth grade son, Nico, to school here in Washington, D.C. I parked the car and walked him carefully across the street. And at the bottom of the school's front steps, I gave him a great big long hug. Too long, I guess, because pretty soon he was squirming to be let go. As he turned to walk up the stairs, I said to Nico softly, "I love you." And without looking back at me, he said, "I know." When he was younger, I'd often get an "I love you too," but for now I'm content with "I know." I watched my son climb the staircase and disappear behind the front doors of the school. And when he did, I just stood there on the street and I wept. Why was I crying? You know, it's often a profitable question to ask ourselves when tears come. Why are we crying? Because often the answer is many-layered and revealing. At one level, I was simply overcome with grief for the death of those children in Uvalde. Heartbroken for their parents, having flashes of imagining myself in their shoes. I was mourning the victims of other recent shootings in Buffalo and in Orange County. I was lamenting the dangerous, imperiled world that Nico and all our children and grandchildren will grow up in, and feeling the weight of parenting a child in such a world. I shed tears of anger and hopelessness over our seeming inability as a nation, as a people, as a democracy, to do what's right and what's necessary to protect our children. All of these emotions and more were just swirling in my tears. And this morning, friends, I want to just stay with the tears. I'm not going to stand before you today and preach a social justice sermon about gun violence or the evils of the NRA or about our broken political system. I preached those sermons so many times over 25 years of ministry, more than I wish to recall. But this morning, I want to just invite us to stay with our tears, with our grief and mourning, and try to see what wisdom might emerge from there. Oscar Romero, the martyred Archbishop of El Salvador, once said, "There are some things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried." What are those things? What are the things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried? The tears of another, for one thing. Another's pain and grief. A sensitivity to the fragile and broken places of our world. A knowledge of the kinds of love and care that help us move through our tears and reclaim joy in life. These are among the things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried. Our tears, friends, can be a path to greater insight, understanding, and empathy. I want to share with you an object that is very precious to me. Can you see it? Yeah, okay. Many years ago, a couple from my congregation in DC gave me this carved wooden figurine. They'd discovered it on a trip to Southeast Asia and told me it was a figure called the Weeping Buddha. Sure enough, it depicts a Buddha-like character sitting cross-legged in the lotus position. But rather than sitting upright in a meditative posture, the figure is bent over, head in hands. He seems to be not so much weeping as sobbing, bereft. For years, I kept this so-called weeping Buddha in my office at church as a gentle reminder to people who entered that their tears were always welcome in that space. In fact, sometimes when folks would cry in my office, I'd offer them the Buddha to hold in their hands as they cried. I've often held it through my own tears. I'll never forget one Sunday I brought the Weeping Buddha with me to the first and second graders' Sunday school class. Without any explanation, I showed them the figurine and asked them what they saw. I was so impressed with their sensitive perception. They immediately identified the figure as the Buddha or Buddha-like. And from his posture, they could tell that he was sad. So I asked them what made them sad. And they had lots of answers for that question, but the death of grandparents and family pets definitely topped the list of first grader sorrows. Then I asked them what helped them feel better when they were sad, and they said, a hug from my mom, having a friend come over to play, and ice cream. It struck me that the things that make us feel better when we're sad don't really change much as we get older. A hug from my mom and a little ice cream still goes a long way. Well, before long, the classroom began to spin out of control as the kids started sharing their favorite ice cream flavors. It was as though they had developed a virtual sugar rush just by talking about sweets. But in the middle of the hubbub, one little girl was still focused intently on the figurine. And she asked me softly, Rob, why is the Buddha crying? Why is the Buddha crying? You know, and that's the title of my sermon this morning, because I think that the answer to that little girl's sensitive question offers us a worthy path through our tears. At first, the child's question kind of brought me up short. I said, well, honey, the Buddha was someone who was very sensitive to other people's suffering. And their sorrow made him feel sad too. So he tried to figure out how we can suffer less. Later, I realized I should have told her the familiar story of how the Buddha was first introduced to the reality of suffering when he himself was just a young boy. Perhaps you know the story. The young boy named Gautama, who would one day become the Buddha, grew up living a sheltered life as a young prince. Gautama's wealthy father, like so many parents, took great pains to shelter his son from the world's suffering. But one day, while riding in his father's chariot, the young man saw by the side of the road a man groaning in pain, and he asked his teacher, Channa, what was wrong. And Channa said, the man is sick. The next day, along the same road, Gautama's chariot passed a man stooped over, leaning heavily on a cane. And once again, the boy asked, what's the matter? And Channa said, well, he's very old. And on yet a third journey, the chariot passed a man lying in the road as if asleep. And the boy asked, what's wrong with this man? That man is dead, said Channa. And the story goes that that very night, having been awakened to the presence of pain and suffering in the world, Prince Gautama left the shelter of his father's palace forever and set out in search of a way to understand and ease our suffering. The Buddha's story reminds me of something a friend once said to me. She said, you know, God breaks our heart again and again until it finally stays open. Maybe that's what happened to the young Buddha. Not once, not twice, but 3 times his heart was broken by the suffering of others. And after the 3rd time, it remained open forever. I think in times like these, when we are overcome with grief and sorrow, we sometimes try to quickly kind of pick ourselves up and move on, or Or we move quickly to a fix-it mentality. What can we do? What needs to be done? Maybe instead what we need to do is just sit with our sorrow for a little while, to allow our hearts to break open and stay open, stay soft, and await the vision and insight that come only from eyes that have cried. Here's one of the great insights that came to the Buddha as he looked out on the world through his tears. He discovered that we can take our suffering in one of two ways. The first path is to allow our pain to isolate us, make us feel alone, like nobody knows the trouble I've seen. I mean, suffering can do that to us, right? It can be so consuming that we feel absolutely alone with it. This sense of isolation compounds our suffering many times over. The Buddha discovered that if we push past our isolation, then another path opens before us. The path of compassion. This is when we discover that our suffering is not what sets us apart and alone. Our suffering is precisely what connects us to one another, to each and every one of our fellow human beings. It's one of the things we all share. In other words, the Buddha saw that our suffering can open a door to a great solidarity, a sense of kinship with the whole human family. Call it the great fellowship of the brokenhearted, the fellowship of the open-hearted. And whereas isolation compounds our suffering, this sense of compassionate kinship, this sense that we are not alone in our suffering, that we are all in it together, can be a source of great comfort to us in our suffering, can ease our suffering. And it's what allows us to help ease the suffering of others. For me, friends, this is the tiny seed of possibility contained in moments of collective pain and trauma like we've experienced this week. The possibility that instead of driving us into isolation, instead of driving us into our respective camps or our well staked out positions, that our collective grief might draw us out beyond ourselves and our tribes and into a wider sense of kinship and solidarity with one another. And that this solidarity might be the foundation for substantive change in our culture and society. Now, I'm not naive. In the past, we all know, tragedies such as these have repeatedly failed to evoke the solidarity of which I speak. That failure is a sign of the profound spiritual malaise, the hard-heartedness of our time and of our nation. Yet I remain faithful to to the possibility of compassion and to the collective power of the fellowship of the brokenhearted. Why is the Buddha crying? Asked the little girl. I think the Buddha cries for all the reasons that we do. He cries for the children of Uvalde and for the people of Ukraine. He cries for the millions lost to COVID and for our imperiled planet. And from those tears comes compassionate wisdom. The things that can only be seen through eyes that have cried. May we too come to discover the wisdom of our tears. Amen.